Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to the Reawaken Your Health podcast. I'm very excited to have a new guest, Marc Azoulay, who's joining us today to talk all about men and men's mental health. So Marc, he is the founder of Men's Therapy Online, and we met through a podcasting group, but I'm going to let him share with you a little bit more about his background because it's fascinating how he got into this work and how he's helping men all over the world. So thank you for joining us today, Marc.
Thanks, Amy. I'm really happy to be on the show and to talk about some of the mental health issues that are afflicting guys out there. I mean,
Yeah.
it's crazy, right? Like in the world, men are definitely a privileged class, right? We are the majority in most places. We hold a lot of power. But in the mental health world, we are an extreme minority. Most men don't access mental health treatment. Many men suffer alone and suffer in silence. And me and my organization, Men's Therapy Online, are there to just bridge the gap and get men talking about stuff that they need to, right? Get us working on our psychology and really preventing some of the major causes of death, namely suicide and alcohol poisoning, are kind of two things that take men down that are directly linked to mental health.
Yeah, that's a really unique perspective that you just mentioned about how men can be dominant in many aspects, but not mental health. And I know you have a very interesting background on how you got into this work. Do you mind sharing it?
Oh yeah, for sure. So a lot. So essentially, very long story short, right? Had a tough childhood, essentially kind of emotionally neglectful and physically abusive parents that resulted and culminated in drug abuse. So I was a drug addict during my college years, really lost, really confused. As far as masculinity goes, really didn't have any idea of being a man. I felt really insecure. I felt really just weak. I was overweight. I was very shy, to the point where I couldn't buy anything from a store even, right? Like I couldn't do like a scripted interaction, like crippling social anxiety, really difficult just to be around anybody or anything. And just a complete lack of confidence. And, drugs gave me that, artificially kind of chemically boosted me and let me be a different person and have a different persona. But ultimately it came from this self-hatred, right? So I did a lot of drugs really fast, culminated in an overdose, and then got into therapy in college, which really helped me just to go back and just like, heal the past. I guess I know it's kind of cliche, but when I talk to people about my first therapist, I say, I don't remember anything he said. I don't remember any magical intervention or magical tool, but I remember that he really cared. He really cared. He was really interested in me. And I hadn't felt that. And that in of itself was very powerful. And I remember crying just really in almost every session for the first 2 years of therapy. I would cry every session. Some sessions would be just crying. There was so much pain and so much just like angst and anger in there. So, went through that, then got into mindfulness meditation, which I think is something that you and I connected on during our initial phone call. And I went to Naropa, which is a Buddhist university in Boulder, Colorado. So I did a 3-year Buddhist studies program called contemplative psychotherapy. So it kind of turns Buddhism into mental health. Did that in that program, got totally sober. Then I went and I did a postgraduate program in New York City on psychoanalysis to kind of go a level deeper and to kind of take in, the Western version. So I had the Eastern through Buddhism and the Western through psychoanalysis. Then started my private practice. So I've been helping men just kind of, I don't know, heal our past, get with it, come up with the times. And I'm sure we'll talk about it a lot during this podcast, but, women have done a lot of amazing work. I want to say that first. A lot of amazing work with feminism and mental health and a culture of sharing and vulnerability. And quite frankly, men are really behind you all. So the idea is like to help us to catch up to a lot of the work that women have done.
So can you tell us a little bit about the Buddhist psychoanalysis aspect of it and how that has influenced how you help men?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll talk about each one individually and then maybe together. So Buddhism, for those, I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar, but just to run through it, like it's not a religion in the same way that most religions are. Like there isn't a God, there isn't a deity, there isn't like a cosmology, there's not like a creation myth. It's more of a philosophy. And there's a series of stories that exist to teach the philosophy, but really it's a lot of monks and nuns sitting down and staring at their mind and then writing what they see, right? So the gods and deities aren't like, I don't know, Zeus or Mars or a Saturn, right? Like they're like compassion, right? Or wisdom or jealousy or, they're kind of these like emotional mental constructs that are then given form. So essentially with Buddhism, the idea is understanding and drawing from the ancient teachings how those demons, they're called demons in Buddhism, but they're, there's like negative emotions, right? How these negative emotions can hijack the brain and keep us stuck and keep us delusioned is kind of what Buddhism would say, that we're living in delusion, which essentially means that we kind of have this mental model we project into the world, right? So like if we're struck by the demon of jealousy, everything that we see is going to be tinged by that level, right? Like we're not going to be able to experience joy because we're going to be like, oh, I want that person has, right? We're going to have that pain and that hurt and that insecurity. So the Buddhism background really helps to create a language and a framework of, we create our own reality based on these mental constructs. And the idea is by stripping through them through mindfulness, which is, sit down, shut up, right? Pay attention on purpose, feel it, work through it. We can become free of that and realize that these things don't have to control us, and open ourselves up to more compassion and openness and, sympathetic joy and love and things like that. Buddhism also has a great thing compared to Western, where there's no original sin, right? It's actually the opposite. In Buddhism, we are like open and compassionate and loving at our core, but then we have these layers of delusion or trauma or conditioning, whatever you want to call it, that kind of cloud that. Versus kind of the Judo-Christian thing where at our core we are sinful and we have to repent. So that was really helpful for me in kind of shame busting.
Oh, that's great. So then as you were learning Buddhism, was there a psychological, mental, or emotional intelligence component that comes in to help drive you to free yourself from your past?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the main thing that Buddhism provides is that clear seeing, right? Is like looking and sitting and meditating and being like, okay, this is what this thing actually feels like. This is how my trauma is manifesting right here in the moment. And there's this forgiveness aspect of like, yes, what happened to me sucked, right? But I'm not a victim to it, right? And in the moment I can work. I think what Buddhism does specifically through meditation is provides a tool. It provides like a really, really clear tool that a practitioner or a therapist or a whatever, right, can like come back to over and over again. And this idea of, for me, especially being, a recovering addict, so much of my drug use was getting away from reality, right? Was like numbing out or changing it or whatever. And Buddhism just really being like, sit down, be sober and feel. That was just the medicine I needed.
And was that enough? Because sometimes when people are quiet, one of the things that they do is they replay their words of bashing themselves or thinking they're not enough or thinking they're horrible. So a lot of times they're fearful of just sitting still and replaying kind of what their existence is because they're so programmed to just beat themselves up mentally and emotionally.
Yeah, meditation sucks. I mean, especially like in the no, I mean like especially in the beginning, it's a lot of that. Right. I think we have this like cartoon version of like sitting on a mountaintop with your legs crossed and your hand in a mantra and like seeing a sunset. Right. But like, that's not what it is. It's usually for most people, and including me, it's like a lot of shame initially, a lot of fear, constant to-do lists, replaying conversations, you get, getting stuck in anxiety. It's like regrets and guilt. Sometimes it's body pain. I mean, it's like I found, and I imagine you find in your work, with the body that like, oftentimes, and it's shitty, the first thing people encounter is pain, right? Is pain or repressed emotions or fear or rage. And, for those out there that are intimidated by it, like, one, it's normal. Doesn't mean you're like, messed up. And two, there is hope after that. But oftentimes the loudest emotions are the most painful. And by like sitting and working through that, then yes, like the peace and the calmness and the, connection and the spirituality comes, but you gotta kind of like dig through the mud first.
Yeah. And it's great that you have. And so your progression through your mental health journey and your emotional intelligence journey has led you to helping men and focusing on men. So can you tell me, why did you end up there? Is it because you're trying to help men catch up, or was there another reason why you decided to go after men and how to help them?
Yeah. So part of it is definitely helping men catch up. I think part of it is, this I've been doing men's work for about a decade, but really doubled down and, kind of post COVID. after seeing a lot of the political strife, quite frankly, right? After seeing like young men specifically falling to extremist groups, whether on the right or the left, seeing the rise of like incel communities, seeing the rise of like hate speech online, I think it's really confusing to be a man right now, right? Like words like toxic masculinity get thrown around, which again, there are some good things to that theory, right? There are parts of masculinity that are very toxic, but for a young man, they don't have that nuance. I think that they're being called toxic for being a man, right? The left is pushing men away, and I think the right is radicalizing men. So I think this is a bipolar, bipartisan issue, right? Where a lot of men are really lost, and they turn to mentors that take advantage of that, quite frankly, right? And groups take advantage of that. So I just see this crisis of masculinity that's really rearing its head, and I think COVID just accelerated that.
Yeah, that's good. So let's dive into a little bit about kind of what are some issues that men face that really affect their mental health, and kind of how are you helping people with that?
Yeah, so a big one that manifests as a lot of different things is loneliness. I think a lot of men out there are unbelievably lonely.
Really?
And there's a couple of reasons, right? I think the primary reason, again, it's another advantage that women and female culture has, is that y'all are taught to share, right? Like that's a main way that you connect, is by knowing each other and being there for each other and reaching out. In kind of traditional male culture, we don't do that, right? I mean, we connect over activities. Maybe it's your fishing buddy, or you're on a sports team, or whatever, drinking buddy, right? But there is this idea of, I think a lot of men don't feel known. A lot of men feel like they always have to be on. They're always in competition with the world, right? They have to be performing, whether that be at their job or as a provider in their family, or, they're always being judged, right? There's this like massive level of walls and shields and masks that I think a lot of guys wear. And, we were told, and it's getting better. I mean, actually the millennial generation, which I'm a part of, but really Gen Z is doing an incredible job of making vulnerability cool. But for most of the guys I work with, and for me, it wasn't cool to say that you're afraid, or that you're, don't know, or you're incompetent, or that you need help, right? There's this idea of men have to do it alone, and we have to be self-reliant. So there's some deep loneliness that I think a lot of men carry, and that then manifests as, substance abuse. That's what it did for me. Depression, anxiety, right? Divorce, like it kind of bubbles up from there, is like men not being known and not knowing themselves either.
Yeah. And when you're working with men on these issues and working to help them through them, is there a different type of learning style? Is there a different approach that you have to address that's different from women? So a lot of women like to just talk and like to just share, and sometimes that's enough. But with men, is it different?
Yeah, I think men, we are more object oriented, right? Like we focus, I mean, there's kind of the phrase, which I think is true, right? It's that like men live in a world of things and women live in a world of people, right? Yes. So like, with my guys, and it's part of my company too, we do wilderness retreats. So we do like long backpacking trips. We do something called psychodrama, where they get to act out their therapy. It's very visceral. We've had guys wrestle each other, for instance, right? Or sprint, or be more embodied in their processing. I do men's groups, which I think is really critical, because guys, we need to look at other guys and be like, is it okay? Like, pardon my language here, but like, am I not a pussy, right, for saying this? Right. I think men need like a lot of validation around that. Whereas women, again, like y'all are conditioned that sharing is powerful, whereas men are conditioned that sharing is weak. So I'd use a bunch of different modalities and kind of more focused on like action oriented and like challenges, right? A little more pushy. I'm not a drill sergeant, but just like a little more just like pushy, because I think it's true for men and women, but I find for men, at least the guys I work with, that if I can challenge them from a place of respect, right, they learn to respect back. Right. A lot of guys, when I ask them in their initial intake, I'm like, hey, how could I be a good therapist? I would say like at least 75% say something along the lines of like, call me on my bullshit. Right. Like they want to be pushed. Right. A lot of these guys know that they're really good at deluding and lying to people. Right. Like whether they're people pleasers, or they keep things hidden, or they keep things repressed from their wives, or whatever it is. Right. They want that punch. Whereas when I've worked with women, I think it's more of like a holding, right? Like you kind of like hold it from underneath, and then the vulnerability and the blossom comes up from that place of holding. Whereas men, like we want to be poked, and we want to, like, that's how we're seen, is when you're like, I don't know about that. Like,
Yeah.
you want to try that one again? Or like, I don't really believe you. There's
Hmm.
something, penetrating, I guess, and intimate with
Hmm.
men around that way of working.
That's really interesting because on one end, you're talking about how they're in competition with the world and they're constantly on, but then the resolution, you are still forcing them to be on in a different way. You're forcing them to be on but make them vulnerable, and you're still pushing them. So it's interesting how that's part of the problem, but it's also part of the solution.
For sure. Yeah. I think guys respond to that, right? Like, I think we want challenges. We want to feel like we're winning. We want to feel like
Mhm.
we scored a point, right? I mean, these are very like patriarchal things. And, there are
Mhm.
problems with that model. But I think for a lot of guys, especially initially, like that model works for them,
Yeah.
right? Like we want like, yeah, good session, like nailed it, right? Like that kind of feeling at the end of like, yeah, we really went there together, right?
Yeah.
That helps guys feel like they're doing it right,
Mhm.
you know?
So, how do you get past this notion of sharing is weak into it's powerful?
That's a really, really great question. So I use it's called mythopoetics, which essentially is using mythology and things like the hero's journey, whether that be all the way back to ancient myths, ancient Greek myths, to modern Marvel movies and Avengers stories. Right?
Yeah.
Men, for better or for worse, have been really conditioned to respond to the hero's journey. So I
Okay.
use a lot of that language in how I work with guys. And the idea is reframing, going back to the ancient version of the hero's journey, where every hero, and you can look at Marvel movies, maybe more accessible to people, every hero has trauma, right? And
Mhm.
every hero has a wound, and every hero has something, right? Like Spider-Man loses Uncle Ben, right? Like Iron Man realizes that his weapons are fueling terrorists, right? Like
Mhm.
Captain America is a man at a time, right? Like everyone, all these characters have these wounds. And the
Mhm.
idea is like your wound can become your gift, right? And I want
Okay.
to talk to guys out there, like your wounds don't make you weak, your wounds make you strong, but it does take work to kind of transmute them into a gift,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Like for me personally, because I was born in like an abusive, emotion and neglectful household, right? Like I became really, really attuned to people's emotions. So now I can
Mhm.
be a therapist, but it
Mhm.
meant healing through all the pain that was there, in order to be able to apply that tactically, right? Um,
Right.
Somebody who is in a house that struggles with substance use, right? Maybe become really, really well at picking up subtle signs of when someone's intoxicated. That can be a
Mhm.
really powerful thing, right? Or
Yeah.
someone can develop a deep connection with animals, or whatever it is, right? But like
Mhm.
the idea of like turning your wounds into a superpower, I think that narrative works for a lot of guys.
Right. Now that makes sense. Does it also help with developing maybe more connections? Sometimes men may not always be able to connect with others or not know how to connect with others. And I've had relatives, male relatives, who've struggled with this and developing friendships with other men.
Yeah, I think it's both, right? I
Yeah.
think a lot of men, and there's a subset of the people I work with that are divorcees, right? So I
Mhm.
think men in that kind of Gen X, Boomer generations, right, that have gone through
Yeah.
divorce, they often lose all their friends, right? Because
Mhm.
in that generation, it was like the woman's job to like manage the social calendar. So like you lose your wife and then shit, you got no social calendar, right? So I think a lot of guys don't have friends, and then like you said, a lot of them don't know how. Because again, you could have a friend that you go fishing with for years, but you don't know like the name of his kid, right? Like that sounds
Mhm.
wild, but that's real, or like you don't know
Yeah.
where he grew up, or you don't know
Mhm.
what it felt like to grow up. So again, like I find the retreats and groups and things like that. Guys like having containers. We live in a world of containers. So
Mhm.
like having like, okay, this is your group where you do emotional stuff, right? And this
Okay.
is your like 90 minutes of emotional time a week really works well of training guys how to connect and be more um intimate, I guess, right? And share different
Interesting.
parts of themselves. Yeah.
Okay. So how does this then translate back into daily life, whether they're in a relationship or have a family or have a business or a job, especially if they're used to being in containers. It sounds, and trying to compartmentalize things. How do you get it to bleed into other areas of life?
Yeah. So there's a lot of answers to that. I think one, so a big
Yeah.
part of my group specifically, as I was just talking about them,
Mhm.
is we do something called process. So there's support group, which you think about, you talk about stuff in your life and you get support. We do that.
Mhm.
Process is where you try out a different way of being. So a really common one, a lot of guys I work with are nice guys. right? Which is like kind
Yeah.
of the male version of people pleasing.
Yeah.
Where it's like they're yes men, right? They're like always available. They're super providers. They never say no, right? They're always like giving, 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 giving. But then underneath that, they're usually pissed off, right? They feel super
Yeah.
resentful. They feel super drained. They feel taken advantage of, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure you
Yes.
know men in your life that are like this, right? Or
Mhm.
you're a man listening that you're like, yep, for sure, right? Like a lot of guys fall into that.
Mhm.
So in the group, we try to help them very, very directly, like have a conflict, right?
Mhm.
And the metaphor I use is that the men's group is kind of like your dojo or your CrossFit gym or your MMA gym where you can like spar with other guys and you're all on the same page, right? Like you're not trying to hurt each other. But it's like, hey, what would it be like to have a conflict? What it would be like to like state my need clearly? What would it be like to hold a boundary? I mean, work
Mhm.
on that stuff like
Yeah.
just like again, just like if you were training to be a fighter, like step by step. Okay, say this. All right, then you felt that. Okay, he said this. What are you going to say next? Right? Just like how if you were teaching like an arm bar or something, right?
Yeah.
So we're teaching these skills in a safe environment so they can then take it out into the world and try having a conflict, right? Try stating a boundary
Right.
clearly.
Right.
And then you have your group of dudes that you come back with next week, and everyone's like, hey, Bob, like, how'd it go? Right.
Mhm.
And then
Yeah.
Bob gets to talk about it and share and workshop. And it's just this kind of like constant flowing. But yeah, the idea is like
Yeah.
practice in group so you can take it to the people that really matter.
Right.
Right.
Right. And is that part of the psychodrama that you're talking about and kind of playing it out?
Yes. Yeah. So
Okay.
psychodrama is like that times 10, where
Okay.
essentially people are kind of like, it's a little bit more dramatic. Right.
Okay.
So I'll share an example of that might help
Mhm.
bring it home to people. So this is it's a great one. So I had a client, this is one of our early retreats, who struggled a lot with negative self-talk. Right. So I had him assign the other men in the group a negative thing that he would tell himself, right? So like one guy was like, you're dumb. One guy was, you're unsuccessful. One guy was, hey, remember that girl that dumped you when you were, in middle
Mhm.
school, right? Whatever, right? One guy was like, you don't have
Mhm.
enough money, right? So everyone was assigned one of these things, right?
Right.
Then they linked arms, right?
Mhm.
And the client had to punch through them, had to like linebacker, football, like go through them. And this client had a rugby background. So this kind
Yeah.
of like worked with him, right? So
Mhm.
punch through it. And while he's doing that, all the guys are yelling the thing at him, right?
Mhm.
The thing that they were assigned, right? You're dumb, you're unsuccessful, Jenny never loved you, whatever, right? And you can
Mhm.
feel like that's a really intense thing to be in.
Yeah,
So
it
it's
is.
like bringing that dilemma that's in his brain out into the world, and it gives him a chance, right? So he's like punching through, he's going. There's a moment where like he feels like he can't do it, so he kind of like slacks off a little bit, and then
Mhm.
like me and the facilitator are like go 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 go, right? And like he finds the energy and he punches through, right? And by
Wow.
the end, he's in tears and he's crying, and like all the guys immediately shift and we all give him a big hug, right? Like
Oh,
it's not
wow.
designed to hurt him,
Yeah.
right? Like all the guys that were shameful thoughts give him a big hug. um and then all of a sudden there's this magical moment where now he's talking about his divorce, right? He's like all this sharing
Yeah.
is coming out because he
Yeah.
felt so held and so seen in that moment, and he
Right.
went through it. And then
Yeah.
kind of going back a little bit, we do like processing afterwards, where we sit in a group and we talk about, hey, what was that like for you, just so it's integrated,
Yeah.
right? I don't want to throw
Right.
people into stuff and not talk about it, right?
Right.
So we integrate. And that moment where he gave up and then came back, for this individual, he's faith-based, so it was actually his love
Right.
of God that brought him back up. And
Right.
it's like really cool to see like that resource get used in real time, and
Mhm.
like remember that, like again, for him, faith was something that gave him power, right, in
Mhm.
those dark moments, and be like, look, you did it when you were fighting like 6 guys. You can do it in your life, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's an example of a psychodrama where it's like you really play out the dilemma, and then
Okay.
those create these like really powerful milestone moments that people can then draw on when it does happen in real life, right?
When you're going through that, and so let's say this individual who you use as an example and everyone else is kind of going at him and attacking him, and you're integrating it afterwards by processing it. I can see how the other people within the group
Mhm.
are learning from that individual's experience as well. Will they then have their own experience of going through that psychodrama if they choose to like go through that and face what's ever conflicting them?
Yeah. So
Okay.
everyone gets to be the main character, the
Okay.
protagonist during the
Yeah.
retreat, right? So
Yeah.
this is we do them all day for 2 days, right? And everybody gets
Wow.
like the spotlight. It's a
Yeah.
custom thing designed right?
Mhm.
But the point I want to talk about that I think you were hitting on, which is really also important, is that so some of the participants, right, like the guys that are in the linebacker line,
Mhm.
they are not mean people. So for them to yell like, you're dumb, like you failed, like that's really hard for them. So in our process
Yeah.
circles, we talk about that too. So even though they're not the protagonist, they're like inhabiting this role, right? They're, again, it's drama, right? They're playing a part of
Right.
somebody.
Right.
And the work can kind of spin off of that too, where someone was like, wow, it was like really tough. Or maybe they're like, well, I really liked being mean to you. Like, what is that about? Or
Yeah.
whatever, right? There's like all
Right.
these kinds of other opportunities for opening.
Yeah.
Because even though there is one main character, everyone is involved, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or embracing him at the end, right? Like that could be
Right.
really meaningful for somebody else too,
Yeah.
right?
This
Yeah.
is great. So you've mentioned a few topics. I just want to see if there's other ones that men come and see you for. So depression, substance abuse, anxiety, maybe negative self-talk. Are there other issues that are both common to men and women, or just even specific to men that they come and see you for?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big one that we should talk about is anger, right? Anger
Mhm.
and
Okay.
rage. Of
Yeah.
course, women experience anger, right? So I
Right.
don't think it's specific. I don't think it's specific to men,
But yeah.
but I think there are different gender expressions of it,
Yeah.
right? My understanding of doing some women's work that I think most women experience anger. It comes off passive aggressive or it gets completely repressed, right? And like be a
Mhm.
nice girl, smile, like
Yeah.
be attractive, right? Like don't have any negative feelings, and then comes out
Mhm.
sideways. In worst case, kind of like like the mean girl,
Yeah.
whatever kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
But with guys, right, we kind of have two versions. We have hot anger and cold anger. So
Mm.
hot anger is what you typically think about when you think of like an angry dude, right? Like a big explosion, fireball, right? Maybe it's linked with substance use, right? Maybe it's linked
Mhm.
with violence, just like a big explosion, a guy coming home and just like taking it out, usually, unfortunately, on his family,
Yeah.
um, and people close to him. And
Yeah.
a lot of that is pain and trauma. I mean, obviously that's a huge blanket, but a lot of
Mhm.
that is like maybe having an abusive childhood. Maybe their dad modeled that. Um,
Okay.
Maybe they have a really unmet need, like again, that deep loneliness that they feel like they need to fight and get really loud to be heard. I know a lot of guys are doing that,
Okay.
right? But it's tough, right? Because a lot of these dudes are really friggin' intimidating. So it
Mhm.
takes a therapist to look at a yelling like large man, right, and be like, oh, there's like a hurt kid in there,
Yeah.
and there is almost every time, right? I don't think
Mhm.
people are inherently evil. So that's hot anger. And the other one
Okay.
is cold anger, which is more like I was alluding to a little bit before, like kind of that nice guy resentment. You
Mhm.
can kind of like the tight
Yeah.
smile, the fake smile, the like whatever you want, right?
Yeah.
And then like, just simmering and stewing. And I find that, at least with the populations I work with, which tend to be relatively affluent individuals, that to be
Mhm.
more common,
Mhm.
right? Because and a lot of as men we're told not to get mad, right?
Yeah.
Like not to be violent, especially towards women.
Right.
Like not to be a predator,
Yeah.
but all that anger goes somewhere, right? And a lot of
Mhm.
guys come home after work and they're just like hate everybody, they hate their lives. And
Yeah.
for a lot of those guys, it becomes self-harm, whether that becomes substance use. A lot of guys, it becomes obesity, right? A lot of
Okay.
guys, it becomes like depression or isolation.
Mhm.
These are the guys that are kind of fall prey to those extremist groups I talked about, right? They get
Yeah.
online and they're venting their anger and someone validates it, and then boom, one thing comes after another, and they're wrapped up with a group that is doing something that's quite harmful.
Yeah.
So I think anger's a big one.
Have you worked with people in the extremist groups, and how do you, if so, how do you pull them out of that because they're so supportive for that person?
I have, yeah. So I've worked with a handful of people that were ex Proud Boy members,
Okay.
and a handful of people that were, I don't know if it was fully extremists, but like very leftist extremists, like obsessed with Twitter, essentially, right? Addicted to
Mhm.
Twitter and
Mhm.
living a lot of their life online.
Okay.
Um, I think what brings them in is not that, right? What brings them in is usually
Mhm.
another issue. With the
Okay.
Proud Boys individual, or individual that's usually drinking. There's a lot of drinking in that culture. And
Okay.
with the leftist extremists, I see a lot of it is like failure to date, right? Or like confusion around
Mhm.
partnership. Um,
Mhm.
so that brings them in. right? And then we get to talking, and it's like, hey, like what else is in your life? You know?
Yeah.
And it sometimes takes a while because sometimes people have shame about it or they're protective, but it starts to come out, right?
Mhm.
And I look at those groups just like any other addiction. Again, my background is in addiction recovery, of like there is a repetitive compulsive thing that bring people to these groups, and
Yeah.
they're not all negative, right? I mean,
Right.
I watched a documentary on the QAnon stuff that came out,
Mhm.
right? And
Yeah.
I think it was CNN or HBO, one of them did it, and they went and they just analyzed what was going on in the groups, right? They're like, what are people talking about? And by and large, I want to say 80% of it wasn't conspiracy theory. 80% of it
Mhm.
was like people sharing recipes or talking about like their kids, right? Or talking
Mhm.
about like, someone's going through an illness and asking for help. And it's community, right? So
Yeah.
like it's community and belonging, but it comes with this dose of like crazy, right? And
Yes.
I think a lot of these extremist groups are that, where most of it is actually, it's just like their friends and their community, and they feel like they belong and they feel like they're important. And especially if somebody, maybe feels unsuccessful in their real life, quote unquote, right? They feel that they can't date, or they feel like they're out of shape, or they feel like whatever, they're unsuccessful. But then online, they're like a powerhouse and they're getting all these likes and all these comments, and,
Yeah.
they have a cool belonging. They're in these secret groups that no one knows about, and they're like
Mhm.
privy to all this crazy information, right? Like it becomes an addiction. It becomes something where people can really dig deep into. So I
Mhm.
help people to realize, like, okay, politics aside, like what is this doing to your life, right? Like at the end of the day, what impact does this have on your life? Is it
Right.
nourishing you, or is it numbing you out? And for most
Yeah.
people, it's numbing and dissociating.
Yeah. That's good. And I'm glad to see that you're able to help people work through what is it they're truly getting from the groups, what is missing from their lives, to then shift them to, interacting with their family or their friends or work colleagues, whatever that is. So I know you've mentioned kind of your groups and your retreats. You also have a program, Men's Therapy Online. Can you share with us more about what's involved with that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So it's all the same. So the groups and retreats are through
Mhm.
Men's Therapy Online.
Yeah.
But essentially it's kind of a step program where a lot of guys come to therapy. They work individually,
Mhm.
usually for about a year and a half, and they kind of get their autobiography done, right? You learn
Okay.
like, work with a one-on-one therapist. You learn who you are, how you became who you are. You do some trauma healing. You just kind of like get grounded, right? Because again, a
Mhm.
lot of men, it's crazy when I speak with women when I say this, but like a lot of men have never introspected, which is
Yeah.
wild, right? Like thinking about ourselves is actually like really rare, right? And like journaling, like most men don't do any kind of form of journaling. Most men don't take pictures of their life, right? Like
Mhm.
most men actually don't reflect, right? We're conditioned to be so future oriented and success oriented that we really don't look back. And
Mhm.
when you do, I mean, you can ask a guy who's had like the shittiest, like objectively shittiest childhood, right?
Yeah.
Abuse, drugs in the house, poverty, whatever, right? And they'll be like, no,
Mhm.
it's fine, whatever. Like my parents did the best they could, right? They just like glaze over it and
Yeah.
like keep moving forward.
Right.
So that first step is like learn your autobiography, feel through it,
Okay.
own it, right?
Mhm.
Figure out what your wound and what your superpower is. Get stabilized. Once they're grounded, then they can graduate and they join a group. Some
Okay.
men do only group, some men do individual and group, right? Based on how much therapy they want, right? But I find the
Yeah.
groups are way more self-sustaining in that,
Mhm.
like, one, it's cheaper, which is great.
Yeah.
And two, it's community, right? It's community
Mhm.
focused. So you're not just connecting with your therapist, you're connecting with other dudes on the same path. Which,
Mhm.
if you do enough therapy work and you want to talk emotionally with other guys, it's really hard to just find guys that can and want to do that,
Mhm.
right? So we just prevent, hey, here's other people that want to talk about feelings, right? Come and talk to them once a week. So
Yeah.
we do that. And then we have, the retreats, both the wilderness and psychodrama mixed in, because since
Mhm.
everything's online, the retreats and stuff are in person. So they're
Okay.
very psychologically powerful, but they're also kind of like reunions where you
Yeah.
get to meet your group member, right? You
Mhm.
get to see them in person. You get to hike
Yeah.
in the beautiful Colorado wilderness, and you get to like
Mhm.
have a shared memory, right? Or you get to go through some psychodrama weirdness, right?
Mhm.
Like you get to have these real bonds, right?
Mhm.
And what my groups do a little bit differently than a traditional therapy group is I actually encourage outside connection. Some therapy groups say, hey, you can't be friends with your group members, you can't do
Yeah.
whatever. Whereas really the goal of Men's Therapy Online is community building. So
Yeah.
like I want people to be friends. I want people to show up for each other. What I
Good.
tell my guys is my success case isn't how much money I make or even how many guys I touch. It's I want you guys to be at each other's funerals. Like that's my success case. Is like to really have like a band of brothers that show up and are there for you in those big moments. And MTO is just a vehicle to facilitate those connections.
Nice.
But the goal is community. Yeah.
That's great. And how big are the groups when the men graduate and kind of migrate over to the groups?
Yeah, so I keep them small. I keep them at 6 people.
Okay.
A lot of therapists will do 8 or 10. I find that I've been in groups that size. I find that there's a lot of competition. Not everyone gets to talk. I'm okay running more groups that are smaller because I think it gives everyone a chance to really get the spotlight. And it really does feel like kind of a chosen family at that point. You know, I want it to feel personal.
No, that's great. And do you orient the groups that they have similarities, or can it be a spectrum of different reasons that brought them in?
I think similarities. So, I mean, a culture emerges. There's often a core that emerges. So, for instance, I have one group that specifically is older individuals, Gen Xers, that focus a lot on fatherhood and, you know, moving into retirement. You know, I have one group that skews a little bit younger. That's more about like finding partnership, right, and building a family. You know, so they do tend to develop a little bit of their own culture.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is great. Is there anything else that we haven't mentioned so far that you'd like to touch on relating to men's mental health or your programs?
Yeah, this is really great. I really enjoyed the conversation. I mean, I think just if you're out there listening and you're a guy or you know a guy in your life, like just keep encouraging them. I don't know. I mean, that's the thing is that like mental health treatment is so underutilized by men, and suicide is, I think, like the 3rd leading cause of death in men. Like it's crazy how much we need it. So that's all I would say. I mean, you can look at my website, menstherapy.online. You can Google me. But really it's just like, whether it's with me or literally anybody else, like get talking to somebody. It'll do you good. You know, it'll change your life.
That's great. I really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you so much. And again, your website one more time.
Yeah, menstherapy.online.
.online. Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. And Marc, I really appreciate everything that you're doing. You are well versed, you're well educated, and really appreciate it. And it comes across very humble. And thank you for what you're doing and making a difference in this world.
Oh, thanks. And I'll be on the show, and I can't wait to interview you online. So
thank you very much. Too. Yeah. So please share with us your podcast as well, so people can check that out.
Yeah, it's Men's Therapy Podcast. My branding is exactly what it is. You know,
it's perfect. Hey, it's great. Consistent all the way through. So well, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you all for listening today. Really appreciate having you join us and listening to Marc today. Thank you again. And we'll see you again next week. Take care. Bye now.